Hello, it's Dawn Michelle from Boho Tarot, and today I wanted to chat a little bit about a growing tarot practice. So I kind of mentioned this, this was a topic that I wanted to discuss in my sort of monthly wrap-up, my monthly reflections video, where I have noticed that for me personally, my tarot practice is shifting and it's growing. And that is nothing new. That's something that's been happening ever since I started tarot, 15 plus years ago. So my tarot practice always goes through these evolutions, kind of like the seasons, change and revolve, and winter happens every year. It comes around, and then we have spring and summer and fall and back into winter again. And I feel like that is very much how my tarot practice is in a general sense and has been for many years. Now, as I've been more diligently journaling and keeping record of my tarot practice, and in particular the way I work with decks and the certain decks that I work with, I can really track this trajectory and see these evolutions, these transitions over a longer period of time. And I think this is a total natural process and something that I wanted to talk about because I don't feel like it's a discussion that we have very often, that it's okay to outgrow things and it's okay to grow into new things. So what's kind of got me thinking about all this, besides all the journaling that I've done that's really shown me the trajectory of my practice, like in real terms, like in terms of decks and seasons and years, what I've noticed, and in particular lately, because I've been decluttering a huge chunk of my collection, and I've noticed that a lot of those decks that I've been decluttering, and I use that term very loosely because I don't really like the connotation that it has, that it's like clutter, right? That it's just like clogging up my space or my tarot practice. These are more situations where I've outgrown these decks. My practice has moved beyond these decks. And so I wanted to talk about that a little bit, about how sometimes we outgrow decks, and I think that it's a perfectly natural process and evolution of working with the tarot, particularly if you work with it in deep ways, especially for personal growth. So as you grow, your tarot practice should naturally grow alongside you, correct? That's my thought process anyway. So I've picked out 3 decks here that are in my declutter or my rehome bin, just as examples to kind of talk a little bit about some of the ways that I personally have outgrown pieces and parts of my collection and why that may be. So I'm going to start with this deck, which is the Tarot of Transformation. Now, I purchased this deck a couple of years ago. It is an indie deck and it is still available from the creator. Let's move these out of the way so we have some space to kind of just take a look at this deck and talk about why it's going to be leaving my collection and really what that means in terms of my personal practice and my own tarot evolution. So this is a deck that I bought in, I want to say 2018, maybe 2019. I'd have to actually go back and look. And I used it in a time where I was very physically ill. I was bedridden for several months, and I ended up working with this deck very intensively during that time as a way to heal and grow through that period. Now, this is a wonderful healing deck. The guidebook really focuses in on healing. So if you work with that alongside this deck, you can definitely see that energy represented in these cards. And I did a lot of really deep healing work in terms of my physical self. Now, physical healing is something that I still struggle with. It's something that I'm still working on, but I'm in a different space now with that than I was at this time. At this time in my life, when this deck came into my practice, I didn't know what the problem was. I didn't have a diagnosis. Now I do. Now I know what the issue is, and now I know how to work with it, how to treat it. And so for me, this deck really represents decks that I have had in my practice for a particular reason, for particular work. And I've done that work, and I've grown beyond that work, and I'm on to different work, right? Onto new work, deeper work, more expansive work, whatever the case may be. And so this deck for me, because it is tied in very much with that time in my life and that work that I did, I feel like my time with this deck is over. I feel like I've moved on from it, not because the deck no longer offers value to me, not because I couldn't come to it and use it for healing work again, but I just feel like that I've moved beyond that space, and my personal connection with this deck is now tied into that area, that time period of my life and what was going on at that time. And that is no longer the space I occupy. And so I feel like this is a great example of a deck that is a wonderful deck, has a lot to offer, could still continue to offer me a lot of guidance in my practice, but I feel like this particular deck represents a time in my life that I've moved on from. And that is a case with several decks that I'm rehoming in my collection. They came into my life at a certain time when a certain thing was going on. I used it for a certain practice. Once I kind of resolved or grew beyond that practice, that deck no longer felt like it had a place in my practice because that energy was now tied into it, or that mental and emotional connection that I had was now ingrained in it. So whenever I pull this deck out, it makes me think of that time in my life when I was very, very sick and I was in bed and I couldn't do anything else but really read tarot and watch YouTube and read books because I was bedridden. And so for me, when I pull this deck out, it does kind of make me think back to that time. And it makes me reflect on the growth that I've done since then. But it does also really represent that time in my life for me. It's like that time of my life becomes ingrained in this deck and embodied in the energy of it. Just for me personally, I don't think physically, probably. I'm sure the deck still reads just fine. But whenever I pull it out, that's what comes to mind for me. That's what I'm reminded of. And that's not always something that I want to be reminded of. I want to keep in mind the lessons that I've learned from the past, but I don't want to keep reliving them. There's a difference between learning your lessons and looking back at what they've taught you and reliving those experiences over and over again. And I don't want to be in the space of reliving the experience. And so this deck for me, while it is a wonderful deck and a beautiful healing reader, I feel like is one that I've outgrown because I've outgrown that space in my life. So I thought this deck was a wonderful example of decks that I have just outgrown, that I've used for a particular practice. I've moved beyond that practice, or I've moved beyond that situation in my life. And so I no longer need the deck to fulfill that space in my practice. So another deck that I've pulled out to kind of represent some of the transition periods that I find myself in with my tarot practice is the Mermaid Tarot. I really, really love this deck, to be perfectly honest. I think it's an absolutely fantastic reader, and I think there's a lot of depth in this deck in particular. But in looking at what this deck represents on the whole for me, this deck represents the more traditional Rider-Waite-Smith style of reading. And I have a lot of decks in my collection that fall into that category. A lot of my Llewellyn decks, because that is the base structure that they base their decks on. And that's not the way I learned to read tarot. It's not the way I prefer to read tarot. While I appreciate the history, the tradition, and the structure within the Rider-Waite-Smith, it doesn't always align with the way that I read tarot. And so sometimes I struggle with decks that are really locked into that kind of an interpretation. Now, this deck actually has a little bit more creative freedom, I think, when it comes to the interpretation of the tarot. But as a whole, in just a kind of general sense, this deck does represent all these sort of Smith-Waite inspired decks that I have in my collection, and I just don't feel that I need that many. This is not my base reading style. And so whenever I work with a deck like this, I do have to sort of adjust the way I read tarot. And I'm finding that the older I get, the more stubborn and more set in my ways I get, and I don't want to adjust my reading style. I want my decks to work for me in the way that I already read the tarot. I don't want to have to adjust to work to the deck. Now, there are times when that is interesting and can create a different layer to your practice. But on the whole, I want decks in my collection because although I do have a few decks that I would consider collector decks, as in I don't really work with them, I just have them, the majority of my collection of decks is for my personal use. And so I want to make sure that I've got decks that do resonate with the way that I read tarot or provide something, some new layer or level to my practice. And I just don't feel that at this point in my practice, because I've been reading tarot for so long, because I was not trained in the Waite-Smith system of reading tarot, these type of decks don't tend to align really well with my personal reading style. The other thing this deck represents is the idea of thematic decks. So I have quite a few thematic decks, as in the deck really adheres to a particular theme, right? So I have a couple different mermaid decks in my collection. I've decided I only need one mermaid deck, and so I've kept my favorite one. As much as I love the artwork in this, and I really appreciate what the creators did, and I think it's an absolutely stunning tarot deck, I just don't find that I reach for it when I want the mermaid energy. I end up reaching for the deck that I'm already connected to, that I already have a relationship with. And so I really want to kind of condense my collection down to just those main decks that I really work with. As I mentioned in a couple of other decluttering videos, or decks leaving my collection videos, I have so many decks that I absolutely love and that work for me really well. I don't feel the need to keep decks that work kind of well, or decks that I just I think are pretty, or I think are really cool, or whatever. That's just not the space that I'm in, because I do work with my tarot decks, and it's not just a collection just to look through. It's a working collection. I mean, I love the edging that I did on it. I love the backs of this deck, but this deck for me really represents those types of decks that don't really align super well with the way that I read tarot. And while I did spend quite a few years trying to make my tarot practice fit within the scope of this structure, it's not super natural for me, and I prefer the way that I approach the cards because I've spent so many years developing my own personal understanding and my own personal language with the tarot. I prefer to work with decks that align with that a little bit closer. So this deck not only represents kind of the decks that I've outgrown in terms of the structure not really working for me anymore, but also looking at thematic decks in my collection and kind of just really picking the few that really work for me, or that I'm already bonded with and that I'm connected to. So another deck that I've pulled out to kind of represent another kind of chunk of my growing beyond some of the decks in my collection is the Saki Saki Tarot. Now, this deck for me represents, it's kind of an interesting one because it does represent a little bit more of where I am with my tarot practice, because it isn't really apparently adhered to the Rider-Waite-Smith, right, on first glance. But it actually is a very Rider-Waite-Smith deck. But one of the things that this deck for me represents is looking at the decks that I really thought I wanted, right? The decks that I really wanted to love because they were novelty, because they were cool, because they were interesting, because they, I don't know, something in them called to me at first glance. But once I get them, once I try to work with them a little bit, I realize that it doesn't really resonate with me. And it's nothing against the deck, nothing against the artwork, nothing against the creator. It just kind of represents those decks that I thought I wanted to love, but didn't. Those decks that I thought would work for me at first glance, but once I get them in hand, I realize they don't. Now, occasionally the flip side of that happens where I get a deck and I'm like, I don't think that's gonna work out for me. And then it ends up working beautifully and I end up making a really nice connection with it. A perfect example of that is the Deviant Moon from last month. I was like, meh, when I got that deck, right? I'm like, it's not for me. It's not for me. And then after working with it and putting time and effort into it, I realized that it is for me and I do enjoy working with it. So sometimes the reverse happens, but sometimes I also get a deck where I'm like, yes, that should totally work for me. It's kind of weird. It's very colorful. It does look like it goes kind of its own little way. but actually working with it really kind of brought me around to the understanding that this is not a deck for me, and that's okay, because every deck doesn't have to be for me. And oh my goodness, if it was, I'd have no money or no space in my house. So I thought this was a wonderful representation of the decks in my collection that I just found after time or, some effort in trying to work with them, that they just don't resonate with me. They just don't work for me for whatever reason. It's not so much a sense that I've outgrown it. It's not even so much a sense that I have other things in my collection that fill this space for me. So this deck kind of represents those decks that I thought were going to work out, but really didn't. I'm finding that there are some times when I get a deck and it doesn't resonate with me. Or I find that I get decks that I have other things in my collection that work better than that, or the structure just doesn't quite align with the way that I read tarot, which when I have other decks that do, it doesn't make sense for me to really keep decks that don't align with the way that I read. And then we have decks that I've outgrown. I've used them for whatever their intended purpose was in my practice, and now I've moved beyond that, and I've moved into a different way of working with my cards, or moved into a different type of practice, or as the case with the Tarot of Transformation, it now kind of represents that time in my life, and it's not something I always want to be reminded of. So now let's kind of talk about where my practice is going now. So now that I'm seeing this sort of evolution in my tarot practice, I'm finding that the decks I am gravitating toward more often are, funny enough, actually almost always indie decks. There are very few mass market tarot decks that I feel really drawn to at the moment. A couple of the oracles, but even oracle, I'm kind of starting to move away from that a little bit too, and focusing more on tarot. The Intuitive Night Goddess is actually a mass market deck, but it was first originally indie published. And I think that really what these decks kind of represent, or kind of an example of, is my work with the tarot wanting to go at the same time deeper as well as broader, in a sense of that I want to dive deeper into my practice, dive deeper into my decks, but open my practice up to a broader range of experiences. So for example, let's start with the Hardy Tarot. This deck does have nudity in it, so just forewarning. And it is still in order because I'm doing a thing with it. But this deck for me kind of represents where my practice is going, as in I'm learning Thoth, and this is a Thoth-influenced deck, but it's not strictly Thoth. And so I thought this was a good example of me looking at going broader with my tarot practice, as in integrating other systems, learning other systems. Come to find out, the way that I was taught to read tarot, which was by a friend who learned from a relative who learned from a relative, passed down, right? I actually didn't get my first tarot book till quite a ways into actually working with the tarot. But I've come to find out that a lot of the things that I have been taught in my early years of reading tarot is actually a little bit more Thoth-aligned than it is Waite Smith. And so it's really interesting, because for me, a lot of times it's kind of a little bit like coming home, because I've spent the last few years trying to work with more RWS based decks, because that is what's available. And that is what is readily on the shelves when you walk into a bookstore. And I'm finding that just, again, it's not the way that I read tarot. It doesn't resonate with how I read it. So decks like this that kind of bring that new idea, that new structure, that new way of working with the cards into my work really does kind of, I think, represent beautifully where my practice is headed. Learning Thoth, integrating that into my work, and also kind of going deeper. I feel like these images and decks like this really ask me to kind of go deeper into the work, because it's a lot of times they're very pippish, so they just have, the number 6 on the card. There's not a person doing a thing. And so you have to kind of look beyond that and dig a little bit deeper into the card and into the work with the deck. And I feel like that really does represent where I am. I feel like my tarot practice as a whole, like it was really deep and into the study when I first started. Then it became kind of really mundane and just everyday. Then I kind of tried to get back into the depth of it and tried to connect more with the Rider-Waite-Smith style of decks, because that is what was available when I realized that there are 900 decks on Amazon some time ago. And then started discovering places like Etsy and indie decks and realizing that there are decks out there that do other things that will allow me to do other things in my practice as well. So let's talk about the Intuitive Knight Goddess Tarot, because that is a Rider-Waite-Smith deck, right? But one of the things that this deck does, I think, really beautifully and opens up my tarot practice in that sense, is that it kind of does go its own way, and it allows for some different interpretations. So a lot of the card names have been changed, and I feel like this is a wonderful representation of tarot being an evolving language. It doesn't have to stay just in the context of the Waite-Smith or the context of the Thoth or anything. It is a deck of human experiences, and human experience and the human consciousness evolves and grows and changes. And I think this deck is a wonderful representation of how tarot can honor its tradition, retain its structure, but also grow and make space for new interpretations. And I think this deck does that beautifully. It really represents that energy beautifully. And it really does, I think, embody the whole idea of working within the structure, but allowing things to have a voice of their own, allowing my practice to be its own thing, to be a unique experience in its own. And it doesn't have to look like anybody else's, and it doesn't have to follow a particular structure, and it doesn't have to follow a particular path. And that is really, I think, where my practice on the whole is going. It's about diving deeper into my personal growth work, which has been really fueled by the monthly medicine that I've been doing with my members. And at the same time, going broader in a sense of allowing my tarot practice to be more open to interpretation again, to working with different types of cards, to looking at the tarot through a little bit less of a specific lens. My life is a constant evolution. I'm always growing, I'm always learning, I'm always changing, and therefore my tarot practice as a primary support tool in my personal growth needs to evolve and change with it. And so the Intuitive Knight Goddess, I think, really represents that idea of honoring tradition, but allowing space for things to be imagined in a new way. Now, the other deck that I have is a kind of representative for my tarot practice and where it's going is the Lioness Oracle Tarot. And this deck I've done a few videos on, and I do have a very deep and personal relationship with this deck. But one of the things that this deck, I think, really illustrates beautifully in terms of being a representative of my tarot practice is where my healing and growth work is headed. So whereas we had the Tarot Transformation, which was very much a healing and personal growth deck for me back a few years ago, this now more closely aligns with how my personal growth and my healing work, how it's evolving, which is very intuitive, very organic, a little bit messy, doesn't always quite adhere to what you think it should, and it just kind of is what it is. And again, that's me allowing myself the space and my practice the space to grow and evolve in a way that feels very natural and very organic, and not trying to fit it within the constraints of a particular structure or thought process. I'm just allowing it to explore and bloom and be what it needs to be in the moment. And a deck like this really, I think, represents that well. I've actually been quite into collage style decks lately. I've amassed quite a little collection of them. They all serve a specific purpose in my practice. That will be a collection that I do at some point too, is to share those with you and how I'm working with them. But what a deck like this really represents for me is the idea of following more of my intuition in my readings and being a little bit less structured in the way that I approach my practice, and kind of just letting things evolve as they are, be what they want to be, let it flow a little bit more naturally, a little bit less structured. But as a whole, this deck and the way that it was collaged and created really represents kind of where my sort of personal growth and healing work and all of that is going in terms of working with the tarot, which is very natural, very organic, a little bit messy, a little bit chaotic. It speaks to me on a very deep and personal level. That's just kind of a little look and a chat about how our tarot practice can kind of grow and change over time. So we can have, you know, decks that once fit the way that we read. And as our practice, as we learn, as we grow more, we might find that we are moving into different styles of reading, different structures of tarot, even maybe, you know, paying more attention to the intuition than the structure. Sometimes decks that we feel like, you know, we've just kind of outgrown, like I talked about with the Tarot of Transformation. They had a time and a place in our practice, but we've moved on from them. And like I said, one of the things that really got me thinking about this was all the decluttering. Not only that I've been doing, that I've been seeing a lot of other people do. And you know, a lot of times we preface these videos with, you know, the disclaimer of this is not meant to be a dig at the deck or the creator or anybody who loves the deck, right? This is just my personal experience and where I'm at. And I think the underlying energy under all of that is that we're all growing and we're all learning and we're all expanding. And as we do that, as we grow as tarot practitioners or people who work with the tarot, I think that it's only natural that our tastes, our needs, and our styles are going to evolve with it. And so when we see all this, you know, I'm letting these decks leave my collection, and these ones are out, and I'm done with these, and I've outgrown them. I think that what is underlying that, at least for me personally, is that it's not so much that I'm just done with these decks, right? I don't want them anymore. I don't like them anymore. That's not the case. I think both of these two decks, for example, are beautiful tarot decks, and I truly do appreciate them, and I appreciate what they have taught me, and I've enjoyed working with them. But they no longer represent where I currently am on my path. And so I'm going to move those ones out so that I can make space for the ones that do. Now, that doesn't mean that maybe someday I might come back around and be like, oh, I need those decks again. So far in my many years of doing this and all the evolutions that I've had, to my knowledge, there might be one or two decks that I have decluttered and then regretted and bought again. For the most part, I feel like once I've gotten to the point where I've kind of grown beyond a deck, then I usually feel pretty good about letting it go and moving on to something new, because what this does for me, it's not that I'm just getting rid of decks I don't like, right? What I'm doing is making space. Not only physical space in my actual, you know, storage, but making space in my practice for decks that align with where I am right now. And so I think that's one of the things that, you know, as we're looking at all of these decks being made and all of these decks coming out and all these decks being decluttered, is I feel like this is just a natural part of growth. At least for me personally, when I work with the tarot, I have specific things that I use decks for, or I work with them for specific times. And then sometimes they've served their purpose and they can move on. They can go on to other places. And then there are other decks like say the Lioness Oracle Tarot that I can't imagine ever leaving my collection. My little trimmed Llewellyn deck here, right? This is another great example of a deck that I feel like will always be in my collection. It's a Rider-Waite-Smith deck, even though I just said, right, I've moved beyond that. But over the years, I have developed such a personal connection with this deck and a way of working with this deck that really does resonate with how I read the tarot, that I can't imagine this deck ever leaving my collection. This deck is not only like a tool tool in my collection, but it's something that I'm very closely connected to and that I'm, bonded with in that sense. And so this, even though you could say I have other decks in my collection that fill this space, that have this theme, that inhabit this world, I certainly have other Rider-Waite-Smith decks in my collection, but this one to me has a totally different energy. I have a totally different bonded experience with this deck, but other decks I don't feel are meant to be here forever. And I feel like they are meant to move on. And they're here to teach me something, to help me to grow, to help me to learn, to help me explore and discover. And then they're ready to move on and to make space for something new. So that was just a really rambly kind of exploration or kind of verbal diary entry, if you will, as to how I kind of am looking at my tarot practice now, embracing the shifts that are happening and how I'm kind of approaching the decks that I'm letting leave and the decks that I'm accumulating. I haven't set out to do like a depth year. I'm not limiting my deck purchases. If I see something that I feel resonates with me and fits a particular space in my practice, I get it. If I come across a deck that I'm like, ooh, this one's not really working for me anymore, or I feel like I've had my time and space with it, then it's going into the rehome pile. And I'm really letting the process just evolve very organically and very naturally. I haven't set any ground rules. I haven't set any stipulations on anything. I'm just letting my practice and the decks that I use in my practice evolve naturally from that space of learning and growing and moving on and letting go and bringing new things in. So I just wanted to kind of put that out there as a thought, a topic for conversation. I think it's really important to bring some awareness to the fact that practices grow and people change. And sometimes, we may pick up a deck and go, this is my favorite deck ever and I love it. And then a year from now, we're like, yeah, I've moved beyond that. And I think that is a completely normal and expected part of having a tarot practice, particularly if you're working with tarot in any sort of a personal growth way. I think that's just going to be part of the natural evolution of the process. And so I think it's important to kind of bring some awareness to that, because whenever I declutter decks, I don't ever want it to seem like it's, I'm just throwing this shit out, right? Pardon my language, but that's not how I feel. It's not how I approach my decluttering. I very much approach it as in I am releasing what no longer serves me in order to make space for new things to help me continue my growth and my evolution. So I would love to know your thoughts on this whole topic. So drop me a comment below, or feel free to make a VR and chat about your own experiences and your own sort of tarot evolution, if you will, in terms of maybe what you used to work with and what you work with now. I think that would be an amazing conversation to continue. As always, my friends, thank you so much for joining me today, and I look forward to seeing you again soon in another video.